Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I want to spend a little time setting up the background for the novel The Cold Dish and the background to some degree for the novel Ordinary Grace. And we're going to begin with this question of who's Edgar, and I think we're also going to ask the important question, why should we care? Let's begin with Edgar. It's Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe wrote the first American detective stories. Two of the most famous are Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. And his detective, who did all sorts of math and all sorts of logical puzzles and everything else, predates Sherlock Holmes by several decades. If you look at the cover of Ordinary Grace up in the slide, you'll see that it won an Edgar Award. And an Edgar Award is passed out to the top mysteries of a year by one of the mystery writers associations. The Cold Dish, if you take a look at the photo, and you'll see that the character has a star on his chest, that he's a town sheriff, puts it automatically in the mystery category. And because the mystery awards are named after Edgar Allan Poe, and because the both of these fall into the mystery category because of the sheriff, I think it's important that we take a look at what are the types of mysteries, and as we're reading, how can we determine what type of mystery we're falling into? This is the same sort of thing that we did with the fantasy novels at the beginning of Trail of Lightning. There's a traditional detective formula, and it has a very, very simple plot. There's a puzzle. The detective is going to solve the puzzle, and the reader tries to solve the puzzle along with the detective solving it. And the goal of the reader is to solve the puzzle before the detective calls everybody together at the tail end of the book and explains how he figured it out. First of all, there has to be a seemingly perfect crime. Usually it's a murder, not always, but the crime seems to be something that no one can solve. The police are stumped. Everybody seems to be stumped. And so they have to turn to this detective to solve the crime. The clues to solve the crime have to be presented early in this novel. They can't wait until, 15 pages from the end. The novel needs to get solved, or the clues need to be presented so that the reader has a chance to solve this thing early, has a chance to get ahead of the detective in this little game of solve the puzzle before the detective does. Obviously, in order to make this a puzzle, some of those clues have to be misleading. Some of those clues have to be red herrings that take readers down the wrong track. The detective novel, obviously, and I hate to just, state something that's really blatantly obvious, but I will, revolves around the detective. And that's true whether it's the police procedural that we'll get to in a little bit, that's true whether it's a hard boiled detective that we'll get to in a little bit, or the traditional detective novel. The amateur detective is going to have the superior mind, superior powers of observation. Sherlock Holmes can outthink everyone. Dupin can outthink everyone. You name the amateur detective, he can outthink everyone else. And he sees things that the cops miss, he sees things that the readers might overlook, and its ability to see things and to use his ability to develop a rational explanation for everything that allows him to be the great detective. Usually, the detective has some unusual physical features or habits. For example, Sherlock Holmes is exceedingly tall, exceedingly thin. usually is depicted with a huge beak nose, and he sits in his apartment and he takes his pistol and he shoots the Victoria's Cross in the fireplace. He is an odd duck. He plays his violin at weird hours. The storyteller, first of all, is rarely the detective. The narrator of the hard boiled story may well be the detective himself. The narrator of a police procedural story may well be the detective. In the traditional, the detective is not the narrator. On the slide, you see Holmes and Watson. Watson is the narrator. Watson is the one who tells the story. You might have a third person narrator as well, but rarely in a traditional story is the detective telling us the story in the first person. When the narrator is the sidekick, the narrator is a bold admirer of the detective. The narrator thinks that the detective is nearly perfect. If I can be blunt for a second, he might even contend that the detective's excrement has no odor. That's how bold of an admirer Watson is of Holmes. The detective is close to perfect. And the narrator, as in Watson, may serve as the detective's sidekick. Often in the traditional stories, the sidekick tells us what's going on. Also, it's important to understand that the author or narrator cannot lie. The clues might be misleading, but there cannot be a lie in those clues. A few more things about the traditional detective. It's going to be a rural setting. Holmes and Watson are a little bit odd in that they live in London, but it's often a rural setting. The victim is usually somebody no one likes, and that may be one of the reasons the police or the family or everybody else doesn't do the deep dive that they need to. It's usually upper class folk, but in the traditional detective story in particular, the upper class folk rarely are the killers. And you have the inept police, they often have false arrests, and the cops need the detective to set them straight. And usually, as I mentioned earlier, the detective gathers people together in some room. He explains how he solves the crime. Many times, the murderer, the criminal, is in the room, and the detective has the cops there to catch him or her. Moving on. If everything in the traditional detective story is about the detective, the hard boiled detective formula focuses on plot, focuses on tone, focuses on setting. It will focus also on the character development, but it's not going to focus on the puzzle. And the emotions are going to be flat. The emotions are going to be very low level. Everything is going to be matter of fact, whether they're discussing the murder, the placement of the body in the room, the angles of the shots, whatever it is, everything is going to be very, very low key. Everything is going to be matter of fact. Perhaps because the hard boiled detective is often kind of beaten up by the world, is kind of somebody who is just fighting to make his way through difficult situation after difficult situation. There is corruption. The people that the detective encounters are corrupt, the institutions are corrupt. The traditional detective story had everyone dealing with, the rich people, and there were unlikable rich people, but the rich people weren't going to kill other folk. Here, there are no clear good guys, including the detective. The hard boiled detective is going to take shortcuts that the traditional detective never would have. And here it's going to be an urban setting. It makes it easier to have smog and dust and dirt and grime to get us back to those low level emotions, to get us back to the corruption of the people and institutions. When we talk about the detective himself, he can be a professional, hired by others, he can be an amateur. They're often amoral. And by amoral, it's important to remember that they're not immoral, but they're going to take morality and twist it to fit their own needs. And often their morality is going to be their personal code. They are going to act in certain ways based on their personal code, kind of like a cowboy in the Old West who had his personal code. Detective is often a smart aleck. He relies on his mouth. He makes smart aleck remark. He doesn't have respect for the cops. He doesn't have respect for rich people. He doesn't have respect or deference for anyone. And he is not averse to violence. He will have a gun. He will punch people out. He will get punched out. And then finally, let's move to the cops. The badge you see there is for Sergeant Joe Friday. It's number 714. It was Dragnet was one of the old radio programs. It became a television program in the 60s and 70s. It was a movie with Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd. It is kind of the OG. The police procedural has official investigations in it. These are cops. They are doing official investigations. It frequently attempts to depict the work of police officers and they're solving multiple crimes simultaneously. Many times those crimes are going to be linked in some weird way, whether it's, a tangent or whether one criminal serves as the nexus for everything. There's going to be some sort of a link. And they're going to spend a lot of time talking about forensics. They're going to spend a lot of time talking about autopsies, how the evidence was gathered, what bag it was put in, how it was filed, how they got the search warrant, the suspect in the room, the interrogation of the suspect in the room. The amateurs don't care about that. Holmes knows about cigar ashes. He's not going to send the cigar ash to a lab. The hard boiled detective isn't going to care about anything. He's going to know that the person was shot from behind or shot from above, and the angle of the entry wound isn't going to matter. He's going to do other things to find out how that person did the killing. Whereas the police procedural, the angle of the entry wound may be a key to solving the crime. The characters, and I think it's important to understand that the characters are important for the traditional detective, for the hard boiled detective, and for the police procedural. The protagonist is going to be a cop, almost always. The plot is going to talk about the drudgery of police work. It's going to include long hours. It's going to include hassle by administrators. It's going to include filling out paperwork. All of that is going to be as important as the crime itself. It's going to emphasize luck. It's going to emphasize a lucky break. They find the witness at the right time. Things that were overlooked previously are suddenly going to be just jump out at in a police report. Something is going to change how everything works, and it's going to be luck. And there might be irony, there might be sick humor. All of that is going to be a key chunk of the police procedural. All of this is going to be important to you guys when we get to the analysis paper, when we talk about how we're going to decide what we're reading, whether it's in Trail of Lightning as a fantasy or whether it's in The Cold Dish or Ordinary Grace as a novel. So, kind of pay attention as you're reading what's being emphasized, what type of characters are we dealing with, which of these little baskets can it fall into, or is there a possibility it's going to merge a couple of these little baskets, and we kind of have to name it on our own. I think I'll wrap this one up here. I hope everyone has a good day. I hope to see you all in the next class period.